On the morning of the 21st day of April, 1945, the air over the small German town of Crailsheim was cold enough to sting the lungs, even through a scarf damp with sweat and smoke. A low haze hung over the fields and the broken roads, and in the distance the horizon flickered with the dull, intermittent glow of artillery, like lightning that had lost its storm. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but the men on the ground did not feel an ending. They felt only the next minute, the next breath, the next burst of fire that could come from anywhere, from a tree line, from a cellar window, from a crater filled with shadow. Private First Class Henry Hank Mallory of the 37th Tank Battalion had been awake since before dawn, not because someone ordered him up, but because sleep had stopped coming in full pieces. Sleep had become a shallow thing, a brief sinking into darkness that was always cut short by the same sharp instinct. Listen, check, breathe, wait. He was 19 years old. He had crossed France and pushed into Germany with a unit that was constantly moving, constantly burning fuel, constantly losing men. He had no decorations, no newspaper story, no romantic legend attached to his name. He was not a commander. He was not famous. He was simply the kind of soldier war produces in huge numbers, and then erases unless something unusual happens, something so hard to ignore that the record has to admit it existed. Crailsheim sat along a network of roads that mattered more than the town itself. By this stage of the war, towns were rarely objectives because anyone loved them. They were objectives because roads and bridges fed supply lines and allowed armor to maneuver. The Americans had taken Crailsheim earlier in the month, and now German forces were trying to take it back, not because it would change the war's outcome, but because it could slow the Allied advance, bruise morale, and prove to a collapsing army that it still had teeth. A counterattack was coming. Everyone knew it was coming. You could feel it in the way scouts returned, with tense faces and brief reports. You could feel it in the way the radio traffic tightened, voices clipped, words stripped to essentials. You could feel it in the quiet spaces between shell bursts, that silence that did not mean peace, only preparation. Hank's crew was attached to a Sherman tank that had already survived things it should not have. The tank's hull bore scars like old burns, chipped armor, dented plates, a gouge where shrapnel had torn away steel as if it were bark. Someone had painted a name on the side in fading white letters, something cheerful, something meant to be lucky, but the name was half obscured by soot now, as if luck itself had been smudged. The tank smelled like fuel, oil, hot metal, and the sweat of men who lived inside it for days at a time. It was both home and coffin. Hank had learned to love it and fear it in equal measure. At first light, the Germans began probing, not with a dramatic roar, not with a glorious charge, but with small, sharp tests. A mortar round landed in a field beyond the town, then another closer. Then machine gun fire began from a ridgeline, bursts that sounded almost polite at first, then grew more confident as they found targets. Infantry moved through hedgerows and into orchards. The Americans answered with rifle, fire, and tank rounds, and the whole landscape began to wake up into violence like an animal rising from sleep. The main German push hit mid-morning. It came with the grinding sound of engines and tracks, and the unmistakable rhythm of armored movement. German armor was moving into position tanks and assault guns, supported by infantry who clung to the sides or followed behind, using the big machines as moving cover. The Americans had anticipated it, but anticipation does not stop a shell. It only tells you the shell is possible. When the first German gun fired, the sound came as a flat, hard slap in the air, followed by the scream of metal passing through space, and then the impact that made the earth jump under Hank's boots. A building somewhere in town collapsed in a cough of dust and broken timber. Someone shouted over the radio. Someone else cursed. Then everything accelerated. Hank's tank was positioned near the edge of town, where a road bent between low stone walls. It was a good position for ambush, short lines of sight, narrow approach, and enough rubble and broken structures to hide the Sherman's silhouette. But it was also a trap if the enemy got angles on them, because the same walls that offered cover also limited movement. The crew waited, engine idling low, gun trained on the road, Hearts doing that strange thing hearts do in combat, beating fast, but also feeling distant, as if the body is trying to separate itself from fear by turning fear into routine. The first German vehicle to appear was not a tank exactly. It was an assault gun, low and boxy, moving slowly, its gun fixed forward like a predator's stare. Behind it, infantry moved in bursts, using the hedges, pausing, crawling, sprinting again. Hank watched through gaps in rubble. He saw the assault gun's silhouette, and he saw something worse. A second armored vehicle shifting in from the side, trying to flank. The Germans weren't charging blindly, they were maneuvering with intent. They were trying to pin the Americans, find the seam, and rip it open. The Sherman's gun fired. The recoil rocked the tank, the blast echoed off stone, and the round struck the assault gun's front armor with a hard clang that made Hank's teeth ache. The German vehicle shuddered but kept moving. Another shot, this one struck at a better angle, and the assault gun halted, smoke curling from its side like breath. Infantry scattered. The Americans cheered for half a second, the way people cheer when they want to believe a single hit changes everything. Then the flanking gun fired, and the world snapped back into seriousness. The shell hit the Sherman's side, not directly enough to kill the tank instantly, but enough to punch into armor and spray fragments inside. Hank felt heat and pressure, a violent shove. He stumbled back against a wall, ears ringing. The tank crew shouted. Someone inside screamed. The engine surged, then faltered. Smoke poured from a hatch, thick and black. For a moment, Hank thought the tank was about to burn like the others he had seen, like the ones that became blazing landmarks on roadsides. But the Sherman's crew fought it. They pushed hatches open. Men stumbled out, half blind, clothes smudged with oil and soot. One man fell to the ground and did not move. German infantry began firing at the disabled tank immediately. Their bullets were not aimed at armor now. They were aimed at the men scrambling out, the soft parts, the human parts. Hank saw one of his crewmates try to drag the unconscious man away. A burst of fire cut across them. The dragging man dropped. The unconscious man remained where he was. In that instant, Hank felt the war strip away any illusion of fairness. It was not about bravery being rewarded. It was about timing, angles, and whether the enemy chose you at that second. The Americans nearby were pinned. They couldn't reach the men in the open without crossing a line of fire that was already chewing the ground. The Germans had a machine gun set up in a partially collapsed structure across the road, and it had a clean view of the disabled tank and anyone who tried to help. Every time an American moved, the machine gun answered. Hank did not think in speeches. He did not think in patriotic slogans. He thought in images. The unconscious man's limp arm, the dragging soldier collapsing, the smoke from the tank thickening, the way the machine gun's bursts walked through dust. He also thought in a simpler, uglier truth. If nobody moved now, those men would die. Not later, not after a meeting, now. There was a bazooka team nearby, crouched behind a low wall, both men pale under grime, their faces tense. They were hesitating because the machine gun was watching the road. The bazooka could stop the machine gun's position, but to fire it they would have to expose themselves. The launcher was long and awkward, and the backblast would reveal them even if the first shot missed. They were waiting for a better moment that might never come. Hank did not order them. He was not their leader. He simply moved. He crawled along the rubble line until he reached the bazooka. One of the team looked at him like he was insane. Hank did not argue. He grabbed the launcher, felt its weight, felt the roughness of the metal under his gloves. He slung the ammunition bag over his shoulder. The rockets inside were heavy, each one a blunt promise. He could feel their shape through the canvas, like bones. He had trained on the bazooka, but training was clean. Training did not include a machine gun trying to erase you. Training did not include smoke and screams and the smell of burning rubber. Training did not include the fact that when you stand up, you may not get to kneel again. He moved fast, low, using a shallow ditch to approach a new firing angle. The machine gun rattled again, striking stone near his head, sending chips flying. He pressed his face to the earth and waited for the burst to end. Then he rose into a crouch and sprinted to the next cover point. He could feel the bazooka dragging his balance sideways. He could feel the rockets pulling at his shoulder like a hand trying to yank him back. When he reached a broken corner of a building closer to the machine gun's position, he stopped and tried to steady his breath. The bazooka was meant for 2 men, one to load, one to fire. One to manage the wiring, one to keep the weapon stable. Alone, the process became clumsy, especially under fire. Hank pulled a rocket out with shaking hands. He inserted it into the rear of the tube, feeling for the lock, forcing it in with an awkward twist. He fumbled with the ignition wire, fingers clumsy from fear and sweat. He could hear bullets snapping overhead and striking stone. He could hear someone shouting his name, but the voice sounded far away, as if coming from another world. He shouldered the launcher and leaned out just enough to see the machine gun nest through a jagged opening in the wall. The German position was partially concealed sandbags and broken beams, but the muzzle flash made it visible in pulses. Hank aimed not at the flash itself, but at the structure holding it, at the space where the gun crew had to exist. He held his breath and fired. The backblast roared behind him, hammering his ears, throwing dust and debris. The rocket streaked out and struck the position. The explosion was sharp and immediate. The machine gun stopped. For a fraction of a second, the valley felt strangely quiet. Then German rifles opened fire from the flank. The machine gun had been only one tooth in a larger mouth. Hank dropped behind cover as rounds snapped through the opening. He reloaded. His hands moved faster now, not because he was calmer, but because he had crossed a threshold where caution felt less useful than action. He fired again, this time at a second firing point where he saw movement. The rocket hit low, cracking through rubble and detonating behind it. A scream rose, then fell away. Hank did not wait to confirm. He had learned that confirmation in combat often costs time you cannot afford. With the machine gun suppressed, Americans rushed forward to retrieve the wounded. Hank saw 2 soldiers drag the unconscious man from the tank's side, pulling him by his shoulders. Another man limped, supported by a friend. Medics crawled out with bandages and morphine. In that moment, Hank felt the difference between a battlefield that is merely dangerous and one that is completely closed. A single gun can lock an entire area, remove it, and life can move again. But the Germans were adapting. An armored vehicle further back began firing again, shells slamming into buildings, trying to collapse American cover. Dust filled the air. Chunks of stone rained down. The town was being ground into smaller and smaller pieces. Hank ran low toward the disabled Sherman again, because now the Germans had shifted fire, and the tank's crew still needed help. Smoke still poured from the engine compartment. The metal hull popped with heat. One of the crewmen, his face streaked with blood, was trying to reach inside the tank for something, maybe maps, maybe ammunition, maybe a radio. Hank grabbed his arm and pulled him back. The man resisted, frantic, shouting that something important was inside. Hank shouted back that the tank was done, that it would burn, that nothing inside was worth dying for. The man's eyes were wide, not with anger, but with the desperate grief of someone abandoning their only shelter. A German tank appeared at the end of the road, moving cautiously, its turret traversing. It was close enough now to feel real, not like a rumor. Hank watched it take position, its gun barrel aligning with the street. If it fired, the Americans clustered near the rubble would be shredded. The tank was not charging. It was doing what tanks do best, threatening an area until humans make mistakes. Hank had 2 rockets left. He looked around for another bazooka team. None were close enough. The men who had them were pinned or dead or too far back. Hank realized something that felt like a cold stone in his stomach. If that tank stayed there, it would hold the road. It would stop movement. It would kill men trying to carry wounded. It would crush the thin momentum the Americans had regained. He moved again, slipping through a gap between walls, climbing over broken bricks. He tried to get a side angle. Tanks are strong from the front, but every tank has a weakness, a place where armor thins, where a shaped charge can bite. Hank reached a position where the tank's side was partially exposed. He could see the track assembly, the lower hull. He loaded a rocket, shouldered the bazooka, and leaned out. The German tank fired first. The shell hit a building near Hank and shattered it, sending a wave of dust that blinded him. He staggered back, coughing, eyes burning. He forced himself to blink through grit and leaned out again. The tank's turret was still rotating, searching. Hank fired. The rocket struck the side of the tank near the track. The explosion was not cinematic. It was violent and practical. Smoke and sparks erupted. The tank lurched and stopped. The track had been damaged. The tank could still fire, but its movement was compromised, and its crew suddenly had to worry about being fixed in place. German infantry began running toward the tank, trying to protect it. Hank had one rocket left. He knew he could not waste it. He waited, watching the tank's turret. If he fired too early, the tank might still fight. If he fired too late, the infantry might find him. He watched for the moment the turret paused, the moment when the crew was thinking about something else. That moment came when smoke began pouring from a hatch, and the tank commander opened it slightly to look out. Hank fired his last rocket at the turret area. The shaped charge struck and penetrated. The hatch flew open. Smoke became flame. The tank's gun stopped moving. Infantry around it scattered. The road was open again. Not safe, never safe, but open enough for movement. American soldiers surged forward, using the disabled tank as cover, moving past it into the next block of the town. The German counterattack had not ended, but it had lost its clean rhythm. It had lost the ability to dominate the street without resistance. Hank dropped behind cover, suddenly aware of how hard his hands were shaking. He realized he had been operating on something like instinct, like a machine. Now that the immediate threat had shifted, his body demanded payment: fatigue, tremor, thirst, pain. A sergeant found him and shouted questions. Hank answered without thinking. He did not feel heroic. He felt empty, like someone who had spent everything in his pocket and realized too late that he still needed to eat. The fighting continued through the afternoon. The Germans pressed again and again, and the Americans answered with artillery and tank fire. Buildings burned, smoke thickened. The town became a maze of broken stone and shattered wood. By evening, the German assault faltered, not because they ran out of courage, but because they ran out of options. The Americans held key intersections. Their artillery found range. Their tanks repositioned. The German armor that had pushed forward was now damaged, pinned, or forced to withdraw under pressure. When the town finally quieted enough to count, the Americans found their wounded and their dead. They found the places where men had fallen and never moved again. They found the blackened remains of vehicles and the craters where shells had struck. They found Hank sitting against a wall, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. A lieutenant later wrote a brief note in an after-action report. Not poetry, not praise. Just a line acknowledging that one soldier's actions had neutralized a machine gun position and halted armored movement long enough for wounded men to be retrieved and the line to stabilize. In war, sometimes that is all history gives you, a sentence. Weeks later, the war ended in Europe. Hank went home eventually. Not immediately. There were duties, transports, paperwork, the slow unwinding of an army. When he returned to Ohio, the town looked the same, but he did not. He worked in the garage again. He fixed engines. He avoided crowds. He slept in fragments. When people asked him what it was like, he said it was loud. Years passed. Sometimes he dreamed of the machine gun's sound short bursts, disciplined, chewing stone. Sometimes he smelled burning oil and felt his lungs tighten. Sometimes he woke up and did not know where he was for a moment, not because he was lost, but because his mind was still on a road in Germany. He did not tell the story often, but the story was there in the record. And that is the strange thing about war. The world moves on, builds new roads, paints new walls, and fills the silence with new noise. But somewhere in a faded report, a brief line preserves the fact that in one cold morning, in one ruined street, a young man carried a weapon meant for a team and used it alone. not because he wanted to be remembered, but because he could not watch his friends die while he stayed still. If you think heroism is always grand, always planned, always wrapped in speeches, it isn't. Sometimes it is just motion. Sometimes it is just a decision that happens faster than fear can fully form. Sometimes it is a person who stands up when everyone else has learned, correctly, that standing up is dangerous. And if you listen closely to stories like this, real ones, human ones, you start to notice a pattern. Not that heroes are special, but that moments demand something, and a few people answer without waiting to be told. And that answer, even when it is messy, even when it is imperfect, can pull an entire unit out of a deadlock. Because war is often a series of deadlocks. A gun that locks a road, a tank that locks a street, a mortar that locks a field, a ridge that locks a valley. Break one lock, and suddenly the world breathes again. That morning in Crailsheim, the road breathed again. Men who would have died were pulled back into cover. A line that might have broken held for one more hour, then another. And in war, hours are everything. If you want more stories like this, stories that do not feel like history class, stories that feel like you are there, in the smoke and the stone and the cold air, then you already know what to do. Share it. Because sharing is how memory survives. The battlefield doesn't keep memories. The earth absorbs them. Only people carry them forward. And the people who carried them forward were never always the commanders, never always the famous, never always the ones whose names made headlines. Often they were 19. Often they were tired. Often they were just doing the next right thing, because there was no time to do anything else.